Well, good morning. Welcome to New Life. Thanks for being here this Sunday morning. A couple weeks away from Christmas, which is hard to believe because it just was Thanksgiving. So you're not missing it. It's just late Thanksgiving, and Christmas comes the same time. And so we are just a couple weeks away from that. Like I said in the intro this morning in the welcome, we're going to finish off a major section of the Jesus Project series today. We're going to kind of close the book on the majority of Jesus' life and ministry, and then in the new year, we're going to kind of open the last chapter of his story, which is the last week of his life. But the gospel writer spends so much time and effort and energy on that last week that it's going to take us about a year for us to get through all of the material that's in there. But we are, and most of you guys know this at this point, we are in the middle of this very long series, and we're trying to ask ourselves if maybe there are some ways that we are thinking about Jesus that are not serving us well anymore, that we could let go of, some ways that we've kind of grown up understanding Jesus that we should let go of. And maybe if there are in its place, we could find some new ways of thinking about who Jesus is, what his mission was, what he was trying to accomplish. And if we understand that better, I think that at the end of the day, we end up becoming better followers of Jesus if we understand better what it was that he was trying to accomplish. And so that's our whole goal for this 3-year series. And again, whether you thought it was crazy when we did it or not, we're less than a year away from finishing it. So at this point, you just got to hang on for another year, and we'll move on to something else, I promise, but hopefully equally as significant. Most of us have recognized that there are defining moments in your life. There are moments in your life that you look back on and you say, things happened in those moments, and again, that's an oversimplification because there were a lot of things that happened up to those moments and all that sort of stuff, but there are moments that you can look back on your life that sort of define who you are and how you have handled the rest of your life from that moment. Some of them were really good moments, and some of them were challenging moments. In some of those moments, you felt really good about the way that you behaved and the way that you acted. And I would wager to say that there are probably some moments that you look back on and you think, can I get that one back? Or is that just me? Am I the only one? Like, can I have a do-over on that? Have you ever felt like that? Like, can I have another swing at that one? Can I try that one again? Because I did not handle that the way that I should have, and I know that I didn't handle it the way that I should have, and yet it still, becomes these defining moments. And for some of us, if we look back just on the course of our lives, we see defining moments. We look back on the course of the broader human history, the broader story of human beings. There are some other defining moments that we look at and we say, man, if things had gone differently in that moment, imagine what would have happened. Have you ever played out that exercise? What if that had never happened? What if someone had never stepped forward into that circumstance and situation? What would the result have been? What would history have looked like? How would it be different? And what we recognize, right, is that to some extent or another, defining moments create on one side heroes and on the other side goats. They create people that we exalt and we say, this is a guy that we should follow after, or this is a woman that we, her character and her nature and her actions we should exemplify. And on the other hand, they tend to define these people who don't act the way that we think that they should, and they are forever marked in history, regardless of the complexity of them as a human being, right? Like, you understand this. They're forever marked as a goat. And when I say goat, I don't mean like Tom Brady goat, like the greatest of all time. I mean like a goat, like a non-hero, like an anti-hero, like someone who did the thing that they weren't supposed to do, and they are forever remembered for it. And again, I mean, there's a lot of defining moments we could talk about. I scanned the mental archives of defining moments, and the one that I came back to is, of course, a sports moment, because it perfectly exemplified this in my mind. And some of you appreciate this, and some of you will tune out for the next 3 minutes, and then hopefully you'll come back 3 minutes after that. I grew up, my favorite sport growing up was baseball. I watched baseball as much as I could. I listened to baseball on the radio, and I was the nerdy kid who, we were just Carl and I were having a conversation earlier, that used to get the paper in the morning, and I would read through box scores, which is literally just numbers. And it doesn't really tell you the story of the game, but it tells you what happened. You can see how your favorite players did, whether they had any hits or RBIs or runs scored, and any of those sorts of things. That was my life as a child growing up, was all about baseball. I still have, it's embarrassing to say, literal thousands of baseball cards that are meticulously organized, if you know me at all. 1988. Some of you guys are old enough to remember this. If you're a baseball fan, you probably remember this World Series in 1988. 1988 was a World Series between the Oakland Athletics and the Los Angeles Dodgers. The Oakland Athletics had won 104 games. They were a wagon. They were like the best team by far in the entire major leagues. Everyone assumed that when they got to the World Series, the Dodgers were not nearly the equal of them as a team. Everyone assumed that Oakland was going to just roll the Dodgers maybe 4 or 5 games. Series over. Oakland gets crowned as champions. In game 1, Oakland goes into the 9th inning with a 4-3 lead, and they have their best pitcher on the mound. His name is Dennis Eckersley. Dennis Eckersley used to pitch for the Red Sox, now pitches for the Oakland Athletics. He's sort of revolutionized this role of the closer. It is his job to come in and make sure that the door gets shut, game is over, Oakland wins game 1, and then hopefully goes on to win the rest of the series. Up comes a guy, an older guy named Kirk Gibson. Does anybody remember Kirk Gibson? I can see some of you guys are nodding. Kirk Gibson, at this point in his career, is like he's old and broken down. Now, I can say that because I feel old and broken down sometimes. He's old and broken down. He's got, both of his knees are bad. He can't run. He can barely hobble himself out into the batter's box. And he comes up, Tommy Lasorda, the Dodgers manager, says, "This is your moment. We got a guy on first base. We're down by 1 run. We don't need you to run. We don't need you to. All we need is for you to hit a home run. If you hit a home run, game's over. We move on." The count goes full, 3 balls, 2 strikes. Gibson keeps fouling balls off. And finally he gets one, right, and he was left-handed, just into, I can still hear Vin Scully. He's like the soundtrack of my baseball watching career, talking about that long fly ball to right field. And you can watch, if you've seen this, Gibson goes around second base. You've seen this. He's doing one of these right here. I saw somebody had that. So he's doing one of these right here. He can barely even hobble himself around the bases. It creates in this moment like this ethos of heroes and goats. Because forever, if you're a baseball fan, you know what that picture was. You know who is the hero. Kirk Gibson's the hero. And the guy walking off the mound with his head down like this is Dennis Eckersley, who's forever remembered, even though he was so good as a pitcher, forever remembered for this one moment when he gave up 1 home run, had 1 bad pitch in 1 bad situation, defines this hero and this GOAT. This is the way that we tend to think, right? We tend to think black and white. Dennis Eckersley is a really good pitcher. And Kirk Gibson didn't hit home runs in every at-bat in his career. But we kind of summarize and we distill down everything to these one singular moments, because defining moments for us in stories create heroes and goats. We are, as I've said, at really this critical moment in the life story of Jesus. And as we've gotten closer and closer to Jerusalem, as we've gotten closer and closer to the last week of Jesus' life, it's really like ramping up to this 9th inning in a really tense playoff baseball game. Because everything's kind of converging to this moment. All of the stuff that goes before this is sort of, we're starting to drift. And these moments in these circumstances are starting to really stand out as critical moments, defining moments in the life of Jesus. And we're going to read through one today that creates a clear picture of a hero and a goat. It says, this is the one thing that we want to do. This is the other thing that we don't want to do. And it's ignoring, and we could go through all of the complexities of it, and we should do that at some point. But it's ignoring the fact that these are 2 incredibly complex human beings inside the story of Jesus. But we're going to see this defining moment. And what do we do in these defining moments? We're going to read from John chapter 12, beginning in verse 1. It says, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead, just a couple weeks back. So they gave a dinner for him there. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining with him at the table. Mary therefore took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard, and anointed the feet of Jesus, and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, he who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. And having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. Apparently, Judas identified himself as a poor person and said, I should take some of this. Jesus said, "Leave her alone so that she may keep it for the day of my burial." For the poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me." This is a defining moment for Jesus. And the way the story is told, we've done this throughout the course of the series, so we're going to do it again here. We're reading from John's story. Matthew and Mark also have a version of this story, which we're going to get to, just marks the end of Mark's, as we get towards the end of the message. And we're going to talk about a little bit about what Mark records about this story. There are some differences in the story. In Matthew and Mark's version, they tell that the story took place in the house of a man named Simon the leper, also in Bethany. John doesn't tell us whose house it was. They also share the story of the woman who comes and anoints Jesus' feet with oil, but they don't name who she is. They just said, for Matthew and Mark, it's just a woman who was there. But John identifies this was Mary, the sister of Martha, the sister of Lazarus. They were in the same village, in the same town where Jesus had raised Lazarus from the dead. The other difference, and again, this is kind of significant, but we've talked about this as well, is that John puts this before Jesus rides into Jerusalem. Matthew and Mark actually have the story after his triumphal entry. So it's a little bit of that, and we've talked about how the gospel writers are maybe creative with their use of time and where they put things and how they arrange things, because they are telling their unique and particular story. And for John, I think, as he looks at this story, this is incredibly connected to the one story, the big story that he just told about Lazarus. Raise Lazarus from the dead. I'm the resurrection. I'm the life. They talked last week about all of the implications of that and what was going to happen, how people were handling their response and their reaction to Jesus. And now he comes back and he says, let me tell you one last story about Lazarus and Mary and Martha. And the story itself is kind of a scandalous story if you really think about it. It's not a story that we should be reading about inside of the Scripture, if we think about the Scripture as like this holy, sacred place and nothing weird ever happens inside of it. Because what happens, as John tells the story, is that Mary comes into the home of Simon the leper, someone else's home, and Martha, her sister, is serving the guests, and Lazarus himself is reclining at the table. He's there sitting down and enjoying the meal. And here comes his sister, and she comes with a very expensive jar of perfume. She breaks it open. She pours it literally all over Jesus, to the point that the perfume is running down his body, down onto his feet as he's reclining there at the table. And then when she has poured out all of this perfume, all of this ointment, poured it all over Jesus, she gets down in the place of a servant and begins to wipe and wash Jesus' feet with her own hair. And essentially what we see, right, is that Mary's act is an extravagant response to Jesus. It's an over-the-top response in gratitude, we can assume, for what Jesus has done for her. Because again, just 6 days before, it doesn't say 6 days before, but just before this, Jesus has raised her brother from the dead. Jesus has essentially reversed the course of death for that moment, for those months, years, however long it lasted in Lazarus' life and in Mary's life. Mary comes in. Says, the only thing I can think of to do is to give you the best that I have. And I'm not going to just give you a little bit of the best that I have. Because again, if Jesus is a guest in her home, it would be completely appropriate for Mary to take a little bit of the perfumed ointment and place it on his forehead, maybe on his cheeks, on his shoulders, like just to welcome him. But here, Mary says, I'm not going to just give you a little bit of the best of what I have. I'm going to give you everything. I'm break open the jar. I'm going to pour it all over you. It is an extravagant response in gratitude to Jesus. She's over the top. And she's taking up the place of a servant inside the story. The servants are the ones who are supposed to come in and wash Jesus' feet after his journey. Not Mary. Mary is obviously, I think we can make some guesses about Mary. Mary has enough money to have a jar of perfume that is worth a year's worth of a day laborer's wages. Mary's got some money. And Mary doesn't mind spending it on Jesus. She doesn't mind breaking it open, pouring out a year's worth of an average worker's wages in what everyone else looks at and says, what a waste. Why are you doing this? In fact, Judas inside the story, Judas says it, but in Matthew and Mark's version of the story, they say it wasn't just Judas who had this same opinion. It was some of the other disciples who said, why are we wasting money like this? Why are we not taking this money and using it to advance the goal of taking care of the poor, taking care of the people that are outcast? In other words, Jesus all along, right? Like all along, all the things that you've said, all the things that you've done, all the way that you've treated people, you have made it very clear that it's incredibly important that we take care of the people who are less privileged than us. We should be taking our means and our resources, and we should be selling them, we should be giving them away, and we should be helping people who can't help themselves. And Judas says, this is a year's worth of an average person's salary. Imagine how many families, he's just doing the math. Imagine how many families we could feed with that offering that you just gave. Imagine how many families we could feed with that perfume that you just poured out on Jesus and is dripping down on his feet and onto the floor. Imagine what we could do with something so extravagant if we were to take this and we were to put it to better use. The other disciples tend to agree. This is an inappropriate use of the funds. Jesus, you are misappropriating funds here. You're taking good money and you're allowing it to be spent on you. And she's taking good money. She's just pouring it down the drain. And Mary gets down, having poured out a year's worth of wages onto the feet of Jesus, begins to wipe his feet. I would demo it, but I can't, with her hair. And here's probably the scandalous piece of the story, right? Is that for a Jewish woman in Mary's position, number one, a person of status, wealth, privilege, for her to get down and take the place of a servant is incredibly inappropriate. You just don't do it. If you are a woman who's got that kind of status, you have people for that. You have people who take care of that. You ask one of the servants to come and pour out the oil, and you ask one of the servants to get down and wash Jesus' feet. You don't do that. And to top it all off, you don't let your hair down. You keep it up because it's not appropriate for everyone else in this mixed company to see you with your hair let down. It makes them think that you're a different kind of woman than you actually are. You're not a respected woman. You're sort of a woman with loose morals. And so here's Mary breaking all of these conventions and essentially saying, I don't care. The only thing that matters to me in this moment is I recognize who Jesus is and I recognize what he's done for me. And what matters most to me is that I properly respond to Jesus in this moment. Jesus says, you guys who are standing there kind of judging this whole scene, and Judas who wants, to put the money in the bag so that he can take a couple of them out for himself. And the rest of the unnamed disciples, we like to pick on Judas, but the rest of the unnamed disciples that Matthew and Mark say were also agreeing with Judas and saying, hey, we should sell this money. We should sell this perfume and give the money to the poor. Jesus says, don't prevent her from doing this, because in this moment, she is anticipating my death and my burial. She is anointing my body beforehand in an act of extravagant response and worship to who I am. And it is the right thing for her to do in this moment. So in other words, what Jesus says, I think I skipped it. Mary did the right thing at the right time. She did the right thing at the right time. Everybody else thinks it's the wrong thing. Jesus says she's done the right thing in this moment. Now, we can think back through the story of Jesus. If you followed along with us, you can think back through some moments in the story where Jesus has said, sell everything. Do you remember this one? Sell everything to the rich young ruler. Give all of your goods away to the poor. And I think, and you could be forgiven, and I could be forgiven, and the disciples could be forgiven for thinking back and saying, well, Jesus, what about that? Like just a few chapters ago in Luke's version of the story, you were telling this rich young ruler to sell everything, give it away to the poor, and then come and follow you. And now you're telling Mary that she's doing the right thing. I'm confused, Jesus. Which Jesus has a tendency to do. But here's what I think this comes down to. Over and over again throughout the course of the Gospels, Jesus has said, it's not my time, it's not my hour hasn't come, it's not the time, it's not the time, it's not the time. And now, here in this crucial, defining moment, what we will see Jesus begin to say is, now is my time. This is the time when all of these events, all of these things that we've been leading towards, all of these things all these hints that I've been dropping, and all of these stories that I've been telling, and all of these actions that I've been taking, all of this is coming to its head. And we are a week away from my death and my burial. And now is the right time for Mary to do what she's done. She's taking a prophetic action in some senses. She's looking forward and she's recognizing who Jesus is, extravagantly responding to his mission and to his message. You're the resurrection and the life. She remembers. You're the one who raises people from the dead. You're the one who signals the dawning of the age to come. And you're the one that we've been waiting for. You're the one that we've been looking forward to. Mary does the right thing at the right time. And here's how Mark finishes off the story. It's slightly different, but similar enough. Jesus said, leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. For you always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good for them. But you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial. And truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. There's a lot of memorable moments in the story of Jesus. There's a lot of moments where disciples, Peter, James, John, do some incredible, remarkable things. Do you know what Jesus never says about any of them? That what they have done, the story would be told in their memory. But this woman, Mary, Jesus says everywhere the gospel's told, every time we gather together and we tell the story of Jesus, we're going to tell the story of a woman who had incredible resources, came to Jesus, broke it open, poured it out in extravagant response on his feet, and worshiped him before he had been resurrected. Before she knew the end of the story, before she knew where things were going to go, before she understood all of the implications of it, she's got the foresight. And again, whether she understood it in that moment or not, she has the foresight to understand exactly who Jesus is. Jesus says, leave her alone. You're always going to be able to do good for people. You're always going to have people around you. And I don't think that we should read that to think Jesus doesn't care about people who don't have resources. I don't think that we should read that as some have, as if Jesus is somehow callous to the needs of the poor and we should just not worry about what they're doing and what they're experiencing in their lives. In fact, I think he says, you can always do good for people around you. And I think you always should do good for people around you. But he's saying in this moment, what she's done in this defining, crucial, critical moment is so important for you to see. It's so important for you to understand that everywhere that this gospel story is told, we would tell the story of Mary, who didn't calculate her worship to Jesus. She didn't calculate well, how much is this, how much is this going to cost me? Can I afford to lose this? Can I afford to give this away? Can I afford to take this action in this moment? She just did it because she loved Jesus that much. Wherever the story is told, we tell the story of Mary, who loved Jesus in a way that can't be measured with pure economics. And I think, if we could, this is a piece of why the story is told. This is a piece of why the story is in here. Because John and Matthew and Mark, in their own ways, as they tell the story, are saying, here's what we learned from this moment with Mary. Here's what we, the 12 disciples who've been following Jesus all this time and are supposed to have been the experts on what it means to follow Jesus, here's what we learned from this woman. Is that for us to follow Jesus, for us to truly worship and respond to who Jesus is, would require extravagance beyond what we are completely comfortable with. It's going to require something of us. It's going to demand something of us that we don't always want to give. And there's no way that we can calculate it. There's no way that you can, kind of with the way that you reckon up your life, you can say, well, Jesus is worth X amount to me. Jesus is worth, and we could put a dollar sign on it. We could put a number of hours on it. We could put a time stamp on it. We could put all of those sorts of things, the ways that we tend to calculate, the ways that we tend to reckon up the importance and significance of our lives. Mary says, don't worry about that. Just give it. Give yourself completely to Jesus. Give everything that you are over to Jesus. He's the one who's dead, buried, and rises again. And if that's the case, then what would you withhold from him? What would you keep back? And for all of us, we probably have a different answer. What would you keep back? What don't you want to let go? I'm guessing, maybe, most of us don't have a pound of expensive ointment that's worth a year's worth of wages sitting around inside of our house somewhere. The point of the story is not, go find your best perfume and pour it out on Jesus' feet. The point of the story, I think, is give yourself completely to him without worrying about what it costs you. Because when we worry, and this is what we do, when we worry about what it costs us, when we do the calculation, when we do the math, we tend to get really skimpy with our worship. We tend to get really kind of reserved. We tend to get really kind of closed down and buttoned up, and we tend to make sure that everything, kind of adds up. I'm like that. I'm a nerd. I get it. I used to read box scores, baseball games. Jesus is inviting us into this place where we break open the best of what we have, give it away to him, the best of ourselves, in response to who he is and what he's done. That's Mary's response. And then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money. And he sought an opportunity to betray him. We got two very different responses inside the story, don't we? We've got one who looks at what she has and says, I don't care how much it's worth. I know how much you're worth, Jesus. And if I think about how much you're worth, how much I have, doesn't come close to that. I can give everything that I have to you. Judas, on the other hand, he's doing the math, isn't he? He's doing the math. He's calculating. He's reckoning. He's kind of making some decisions about Jesus. He's looking at Jesus and he's saying, based on what I see here in this moment, Jesus, based on the way this story is going, based on the things that you are doing, the things that you are saying, and the way that you are employing your tactics and your strategy, I'm out. If you're going to let people pour out a year's worth of wages onto your feet, and you're going to let her act like that in this moment, in this scene, I'm out. I can't follow a Messiah like that. I can't give myself completely to a person who allows these things to happen. I think that the things that I think are more important than the things that you think are important, Jesus. And so because of that, because I think, Jesus, you don't reflect my values well enough, right? This is Judas. You don't reflect my values well enough. I'm going to eject on this whole gospel mission, and I'm going to go find the chief priests. I'm going to find the religious leaders. And it's interesting to me, right, that in this moment, Judas is so concerned. He's like 300 denarii. He's like, hey, a year's worth of wages. And then he goes to the chief priests and the Pharisees, and they give him a tenth of it. And he takes it for Jesus. He sells Jesus out based on the math. For him, it doesn't add up. And here's the thing, right? I don't think if you are ever adding it up and you do the calculation based on the way that you want to do the calculation, it's never going to add up. It's just not. You're going to look at it someday. You're going to look at, well, Jesus, he's so demanding. He wants so much of me. He wants my time, and he wants money, and he wants my service, and he wants my willingness, and he wants my devotion, and he wants my obedience. And we start to stack all of those sorts of things up, and we're like, well, that's a lot, Jesus. If you would just demand a little bit less of me, I would be happy to give just a little bit less. Mary doesn't do the math. I would encourage you, stop doing the math if you want to follow Jesus. Mary honors Jesus and receives honor in return. This is how the story goes. Mary says, I'm not going to do the math. Whatever it is, I'll give it gladly. And I won't reckon it. I won't account for it. I won't put it in my notebook and kind of balance and check everything out and make sure everything adds up at the end. Because she understands. She understands who Jesus is. And she understands that even if she gives everything that she is and everything that she has, it's not enough. Judas abandons Jesus, and in return, what he receives is dishonor. In the story, right? You read the story. I didn't have to tell you who the hero was and who the goat is. I didn't have to tell you who does the thing that we're supposed to do and who does the thing that we're not supposed to do. You can read it right there. Judas does the math, and the math never adds up for him. And because of that, a person who spent 3 years following Jesus saw all of the things that Peter and James and John and Andrew and Mary had seen, saw everything. All those things that you and you've probably said this before. Oh, if I was there, I would have believed. No, you easy. Come on. If you were there and Jesus called you out of the boat, you would have definitely gotten out of the boat. You would have walked on the water, and you wouldn't have even fallen in the water like Peter did, right? Like if you were there and Jesus said, I'm going to feed 5,000 people with just 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, you would have been like, absolutely, Jesus. Yeah, right? Like we think if we were there, we would believe. And Judas tells us that even if you were there in that moment and you're doing the math, it still doesn't add up for you. It wasn't what he saw. It wasn't what he experienced. It was his response to what he saw, his response to what he experienced that differentiated him from Mary. Mary sees, and she responds in a way that honors Jesus. Judas sees the same thing and responds in a different way. And that's the crux of the gospel, right? We can talk about what Jesus said, we could talk about what Jesus did, but at the end of the day, it comes down to what do you do to respond to it? Like, I know how I want to respond to it, and I know how Mary responded to it, and I know how Judas responded to it, and I know that, again, it could be overly dramatized, or we could overly simplify that, but essentially, these are the two things that are in front of us, right? We respond in honor to Jesus, or we respond in a way that dishonors Jesus, and those are essentially the two choices that are laid out in front of us. How are you going to respond to the story of Jesus? And that's such a crucial and critical moment for you. You have to understand, you've got to determine that for yourself. I can't do that for you. No one else sitting here can do that for you. All of the other disciples couldn't convince Judas, hey, stay in this thing. Stay with us. Jesus himself can't convince Judas to stay in this thing. You get to choose. You decide how you respond. And as we sort of move and push into this final week of Jesus' life, all of those decisions get amplified. All of those decisions become more and more apparent to us. And we're going to see Jesus say and do some things that really drive home this point. Look, how do you respond? What will you do with Jesus? Will you do the math? Or are you going to give it up? Stop doing the math and just follow. I'm going to pray for you this morning. Jesus, I'm grateful that there are examples for us inside the story of the men and women who just understood who you were, embraced who you are, and gave themselves fully and completely over to you. And I pray for us this morning that are sitting here and maybe are kind of wavering between those responses, or we find ourselves sometimes responding in that extravagant response of worship, and other times we find ourselves doing the math in our lives. I pray that we would follow the example that Mary set for us. I pray that we would be willing to be extravagant in our response to you, that we wouldn't calculate and hold back pieces of ourselves that we want to keep and hang on to. But that with everything that we are and everything that we have, we would devote ourselves to you. You are worthy of that kind of worship, and we want to give it to you. So it's in your name that we pray. Amen.